Blood stained the gray concrete floor of Pelican Bay's high-security yard. The sound of sirens screamed across the prison walls as guards shouted for everyone to get down. But no one listened. Two rival prison gangs had clashed in the middle of the recreation yard, turning what was supposed to be a quiet afternoon into a war zone. Metal shanks glinted under the harsh California sun, and men in orange uniforms ran, ducked, and swung with wild fury. In seconds, chaos took over. Bodies fell. Blood spread. The shouting turned into groans and cries for help. A young inmate, barely 20, was dragged by his crew behind a concrete barrier, bleeding from his shoulder. The fight wasn't just about control anymore. It was about survival. And then a loud explosion echoed through the yard, something no one expected inside one of America's most secure prisons. The ground shook, the alarms grew louder, and smoke filled the air. Guards rushed in with shields, firing warning shots to stop the riot. Through the haze, one man stood still, his face cold and unreadable. He wasn't scared, he was waiting for this moment. But how did it all come to this? How did Pelican Bay, a place built to control chaos, become the heart of a gang war that no one could stop? It started years before, when the prison first opened its doors to some of the most dangerous men in the country. Pelican Bay was supposed to break them, to keep the worst of the worst in total isolation. But what no one expected was that the walls themselves would become a breeding ground for power, loyalty, and revenge. Inside those cold gray blocks, the inmates learned how to rule without ever meeting face to face. Messages were sent through coded letters, tiny notes hidden in legal mail, and whispers passed during meal runs. The gangs had their own system, leaders, soldiers, and rules. Anyone who broke them paid in blood. At first, it was quiet. The guards thought they had control. They believed that keeping the leaders locked in the SHU, the Security Housing Unit, would weaken the gangs, but instead it made them stronger. The leaders began to communicate from their cells, planning moves that reached across the entire prison system. They called it running the yard from the box. One man, known only by his street name Ghost, became a silent legend. No one ever saw his face, but his word was law. When Ghost ordered something, it happened, no matter where you were in the prison. Even the guards began to whisper about him. Then came the tension. A small argument in the dining hall between two inmates from rival groups sparked whispers of war. The prison officials ignored it at first. Fights were common. But this wasn't an ordinary fight. It was a test to see who would control Pelican Bay. Over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen. Certain inmates were moved around. Supplies went missing. A rumor spread that someone had smuggled in a weapon. The tension built like a ticking bomb. And then, one foggy morning, a guard discovered a body in the shower area, stabbed multiple times with a hand-drawn symbol carved into the wall beside him. It was a warning. The gangs were done hiding. From that moment, Pelican Bay turned into a battlefield. Every cell block was a zone of danger. The guards locked everything down, but it was too late. The gangs had already declared war, and when the riot finally broke out in the yard, the one that left men bleeding, alarms blaring, and smoke filling the air, it wasn't by accident. It was planned. But the shocking part wasn't the blood or the violence. It was who started it. Someone no one ever suspected. Someone who wasn't even supposed to be there that day. The truth about that moment would change Pelican Bay forever. The riot yard was silent now, except for the hum of distant alarms and the soft clatter of boots echoing down the corridor. The smell of smoke still hung in the air. Prison staff were shaken, moving fast to clean up what was left behind. Dozens of inmates were taken away on stretchers. Others were dragged in chains, faces bruised and eyes filled with hate. In the middle of all this, Ghost sat alone in his dark cell inside the SHU. He hadn't been in the yard during the riot, but every guard knew his hands were behind it. Somehow, from inside a cell with nothing but concrete walls, Ghost had started a war. He stared at the ceiling, calm and cold, as if everything had gone according to plan. But someone had broken the code that day. A man from his own crew had gone rogue, acting too early, forcing Ghost's plan into the open before he gave the signal. That's why the explosion happened. It wasn't supposed to, and now the whole prison was locked down. Ghost closed his eyes and listened. Even through the thick door, he could hear the anger in the voices of the guards. He knew they were coming for him, but he also knew they couldn't touch him. Not yet. Because if they did, the other half of the plan would begin. 3 days passed before the warden came to his cell. "You think you run this place?" the warden said, voice tight with fury. "We'll break every link you have." Ghost didn't reply. He only smiled. You can't break something you can't see. Meanwhile, in another block of Pelican Bay, a young inmate named Rico sat on the edge of his bunk, trembling. He wasn't a gang member. He was serving time for a small robbery gone wrong, but he'd been placed in the wrong unit. The day of the riot, he'd seen things he wished he could forget. Men stabbed, guards dragged, and one prisoner setting off a homemade blast from under the benches. He couldn't get the sound out of his head. Now Rico was scared. He knew someone would blame him for what he saw. He tried to keep quiet, but one of the gang soldiers approached him in the chow line days later. The man leaned close and whispered, "Ghost wants to see you." Rico froze. "Me? Why?" "Because you saw something you shouldn't have," the man replied. That night, Rico was escorted to the SHU for questioning. The guards didn't know Ghost had arranged it. When he entered the dark corridor, the air was thick with silence. Through a small slot in the cell door, Ghost's voice came out calm and sharp. "You were in the yard," Ghost said. "Tell me what you saw." Rico hesitated. I saw everything, but I didn't say nothing to nobody." Ghost chuckled softly. "Good, because if you did, I'd know." Rico swallowed hard. "Who started it? It wasn't your crew, was it?" Ghost didn't answer at first. Then he said, "Sometimes you have to start a storm to clean the air." Rico didn't understand, but the words haunted him. Before he left, Ghost said something else. "Stay alive, kid. Things are only just beginning." Days later, a rumor spread that one of the guards had been caught smuggling information to an inmate. No one knew who the guard was, but everyone suspected it was connected to Ghost. The prison went into deeper lockdown, isolating entire units for weeks. The silence drove people mad. Some banged on doors. Others talked to themselves. But inside his cell, Ghost waited patiently. He knew that isolation didn't break strong minds. It sharpened them. And in the quiet, he began to plan something bigger, something even the warden couldn't stop. One cold night, as the fog rolled thick over the prison yard, a guard doing rounds found a message scratched faintly into the metal of Ghost's door. It read, "War isn't over. It's moving inside." The guard stepped back, realizing what it meant. Whatever peace they thought they had after the riot was a lie. Something darker was coming, something that would tear Pelican Bay apart from the inside. And by the time they figured it out, it would already be too late. The wind howled through the narrow gaps of Pelican Bay's cold concrete walls. Nights were darker now. The lights in the SHU flickered, and the tension in the air felt heavy, like the whole prison was holding its breath. After the riot, Pelican Bay had turned into a fortress of silence. Every inmate was locked down 23 hours a day. Meals were pushed through small metal slots, and the sound of footsteps in the hall was the only sign of life. But under that silence, something dangerous was growing. Ghost's message, "War isn't over, it's moving inside," had reached the right ears. Even though the guards tried to erase it, the words spread from one cell to another, carried by whispers and coded notes. The gangs were rebuilding. Only this time they weren't fighting for control of the yard. They were fighting for control of the isolation units themselves. Inside one of those dark cells, Rico sat on his bunk, shaking. He hadn't slept in 2 nights. He couldn't stop thinking about Ghost's voice. Calm, sharp, and certain. "Stay alive, kid," he'd said. But how could he when he knew too much? 2 days later, a new guard named Torres was assigned to the SHU. He was young and fresh out of training, full of confidence and unaware of how dangerous this block was. On his first night shift, he noticed something strange. When he passed by Ghost's cell, the inmate was sitting perfectly still, staring at the wall. But on the floor, Torres saw a small, folded piece of paper, pushed halfway through the food slot. He hesitated, then picked it up. There were only 3 words written on it. "You're already part." Torres frowned. He looked through the slot again, but Ghost's eyes were closed, like he was asleep. The guard pocketed the note, uneasy but curious. He didn't report it. That was his first mistake. By morning, the note's meaning started to unfold. Torres found another message. This time hidden under a tray from a different inmate. It had the same handwriting. This one said, "Deliver tonight." The guard's heart pounded. He realized someone was using him, maybe for something he didn't understand. But he couldn't tell his supervisors now. If he did, they'd think he was involved. That night, Torres followed the instructions. He placed the second note under the food slot of another SHU cell. The inmate inside gave a short laugh. "Welcome to the game," the man said quietly. Meanwhile, Rico was moved to a new cell, right next to Ghost. He didn't ask why. He knew there was no such thing as coincidence in Pelican Bay. That night, Ghost spoke through the vent between their cells. "You're smart, Rico. You didn't talk. That's why you're still breathing." Rico swallowed hard. "Why did you start all this?" he asked. Ghost's voice lowered. "Because power doesn't come from the yard. It comes from fear. And right now, everyone in this place is afraid." Before Rico could reply, the lights suddenly went out across the entire block. The hum of electricity stopped. For the first time in years, Pelican Bay went completely dark. Alarms started to flash red, and guards shouted in panic. Ghost's laughter echoed through the vents. "It's time," he whispered. Doors clanged. Somewhere down the corridor, metal screeched as if locks were being forced open. Inmates began to shout and bang on their doors. Rico pressed his ear to the vent. "What's happening?" he yelled. Ghost answered with a chilling calm. "Isolation doesn't stop war. It only hides it until it's ready." Torres, still in the control room, looked at the dark monitors and realized what had happened. Someone had triggered the power from inside the SHU, something only a guard could have access to. He froze. The notes, the messages. He had delivered the final step of Ghost's plan without even knowing it. The low, seek-down sirens roared as red emergency lights flickered on. One by one, cell doors began to buzz, the locks releasing by remote command. The gangs were free, inside the most secure prison in America. Torres grabbed his radio. "Control, this is Unit C. The cells are opening. We've got a breach." Static, no response. Ghost's voice came again, soft but strong, through the vent near Rico's ear. "It begins now." And just like that, the walls of Pelican Bay trembled once more, as the sound of footsteps and shouts filled the darkness. This time it wasn't a riot, it was something worse. The red emergency lights flickered like bloodstains on the walls as Pelican Bay shook with the sound of mere metal slamming and voices screaming. Every corridor echoed with chaos. Inmates rushed out of their cells, some with makeshift weapons, others just running wild. The smell of sweat and smoke mixed with fear. Torres clutched his radio, shouting for backup that never came. His heart pounded as he ran through the control corridor, trying to shut down the system. But he knew it was useless. The power grid had been triggered from deep inside, somewhere only Ghost could reach through his network of messages and loyal followers. In the middle of all this, Rico crouched behind a steel door, shaking. He could hear footsteps approaching, the sound of boots on concrete. Then that same calm voice came through the vent again. "Rico," Ghost said, "the world outside thinks they've locked us away, but they don't see the truth. The truth is, they built a cage and threw away the key, and now the cage is fighting back." Rico swallowed hard. "You don't have to do this. People will die," Ghost chuckled softly. "People already died the day they walked in here. Tonight they'll finally be seen." A loud explosion rattled the ground beneath them. Smoke poured through the vents. Alarms screamed again. Rico covered his ears. "What did you do?" Ghost's tone didn't change. "I didn't do anything." "They did. I just gave them the signal." Suddenly, Torres burst into the block, flashlight shaking in his hand. He spotted Rico through the bars. You know where he is?" Rico hesitated, looking between the guard and the vent. "He's in there, but don't open that door." Torres ignored him and stepped closer to Ghost's cell. "This ends now," he yelled. "You've got nowhere to run." Ghost's voice was calm as ever. "Run? I've already won." Then, out of the darkness, a low rumble filled the hall. Smoke flooded in as the emergency sprinklers kicked on, spraying water over everything. Through the haze, Ghost stood by the door, arms spread, his orange uniform soaked. "You can chain my body," he said quietly, "but you'll never lock down an idea." Torres raised his taser. "Don't move." Ghost smiled faintly. "It's not me you should be aiming at." A crash echoed from behind. Another group of inmates had forced their way in through the secondary corridor. Rico jumped up, heart racing. The gangs were seconds away from tearing everything apart. Without thinking, he grabbed the radio from Torres's belt and shouted, "Activate full lockdown, now!" The command was heard in the control tower. A second later, the heavy metal blast door slammed down, trapping everyone inside. Ghost turned his head slowly toward Rico. Their eyes met through the mist. "You just saved them," Ghost said softly, "but you also saved my message." Torres pointed his taser again. "It's over." Ghost stepped closer to the glass, his face lit by the red warning light. "Nothing's ever over in Pelican Bay." Before Torres could respond, the sprinklers shorted the control panel, plunging the block into sudden darkness. When the lights came back on, seconds later, Ghost's cell was empty. The door was still locked, but he was gone. No hole, no blood, no sign. Just a single piece of paper lying on the floor. Torres bent down to pick it up. It read, "Isolation dozen. T-end behind walls. It begins inside men's minds." Outside, dawn broke over Pelican Bay. The riot was contained. The smoke cleared. The warden gave a press statement calling it an isolated incident. But Rico and Torres knew the truth. Somewhere in that prison, or beyond it, Ghost was still in control. And as the first light hit the cold gray walls, the silence that followed didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting.